Monster Hunter Wilds is a disappointment. But does that mean it's a bad game? No. In fact, I think it's a great game. But in so many ways, it feels like a step back from that which came before, and I'm left dumbfounded at how a great game can simultaneously be overflowing with so much missed potential. There are ways in which Wilds feels both ambitious and half-baked, solid but unfinished. The best way I can describe it is that it's what I would expect of a game from such a talented team if they weren't quite given the time necessary to realize their goals. Many of the cracks in Wilds seem fixable and relatively well hidden with polish and presentation. To casual players and newcomers, I suspect many of these issues are hiding in plain sight, because as I said, it's still a great game. But it's when compared against previous Monster Hunter titles that the problems I plan to talk about in this video start to arise. I didn't start new stuff. So what's this pretty... Oh, is this just your, like, logout? Like, what is this? Oh, this is the Wild... This is the logo screen. That's cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now the truth is, this isn't the kind of video I want to make. It says right at the top of my channel that I make positive videos about games, and I've held true to that for the most part. But I've often commented on the nature of criticism and how to deliver it respectfully. And so I figured now is as good a time as any to practice what I preach and demonstrate what respectful criticism looks like. So with that said, this won't be a video shitting on Monster Hunter Wilds. I won't be reaching for ridiculous hyperboles. I won't pretend a great game is bad or act like the developers are incompetent. Simply put, I know my place, and I have too much respect for the people who make games to behave like that. But I will be talking about the issues I have with Monster Hunter Wilds, as well as why I fear they may be symptomatic of a more insidious trend. One that has been slowly eroding many of the games and franchises we've grown to love over the years. However, before we get to that, I want to give credit where it's due and go over what I think Monster Hunter Wilds does well. Because as I already said, in spite of the issues I'll be talking about later, I do believe Monster Hunter Wilds is still a generally great game. And that's due in large part to the fact that at its core, it's still Monster Hunter, and Monster Hunter is awesome. For starters, you're still hunting incredible monsters with some of the coolest weapons in gaming. And while there are pieces of that which I do think have suffered in Wilds, there are also undeniable improvements. Nearly every component of the game just feels the most polished it's ever been. It's most apparent in the little things, like how the characters move. And as I just mentioned, I suspect a big part of what makes the game feel so good is its presentation. Wilds is just a beautiful game, plain and simple. There are some things that I immediately do appreciate about Wilds, like the way you run around, the inertia and the smoothness, and the way your feet are grounded to the environment. It feels very good, right? Your character walking over the... Yeah, it's very polished, feels very nice. It's more visual stuff, but it's visual stuff that does contribute to feel, right? So I do get that, where I'm like, yeah, this game feels hella fucking polished. Like, it's a good reminder of that, because I think Monster Hunter, kind of across the board up until now, there's a little bit of, even in World and in Rise, there's a little bit of clunk, and I feel like this is kind of polished out whatever clunkiness was still remaining. I'm of the opinion that Monster Hunter doesn't really need or benefit much from having a story. By all accounts, Wilds does a better job with its storytelling and narrative than previous titles. I say by all accounts because I have to be honest and say that I skipped pretty much all of it. Now, I'm not normally the type to skip much of anything in a game, especially not one I plan to make content on. However, as someone who already enjoys Monster Hunter and what it offers, the better than usual story only ever got in the way of the good stuff for me. Now, in my defense, I did give the story a chance at the start. It just wasn't interesting enough to keep me invested. In any case, my point is that I'm not really the right person to be talking about the story, and every other person I've spoken with has said it's at least a step up from the previous titles. I wish they wouldn't even bother with the story. I think it's wasted resources and effort. Monster Hunter is Monster Hunter. I like to go hunt monsters.
I disagree completely. I think the story is fantastic this time around. You gotta enjoy you gotta smell the flowers, Bohan.
I feel like Monster Hunter is a game that could be perfect a 10 out of 10 with no narrative. So I feel like why bother? Why not make the rest of it better? But
because
that's
narrative is another one of those levers that they pull to make it more approachable to more people.
Yeah,
you just drop people.
Well, I think we can see where I stand on that.
Go hunt things. Like the game would be even more confusing for people.
As for other things I think the game deserves credit for, most if not all of the weapons have been updated with a handful of small changes and improvements to their base moveset. As for mechanics that are more universal, every weapon has received a new move called a focus attack, that when connecting with a wound on a monster will break that wound, dealing a chunk of damage and often staggering or knocking over the monster. On top of that, nearly every weapon got a new defensive tool. For example, weapons with shields can now perfect guard by blocking just before an attack hits, negating all damage. In addition to this, blocking or perfect guarding builds up a sort of stagger meter that when full will cause the monster to clash with your shield in an awesome little quick time event. For weapons without a shield, you've either been given an offset attack, which when timed correctly will basically parry the monster out of its attack animation, or the ability to perfect dodge, which will iframe through an attack and give you some buffs. The one exception to this seems to be the light bowgun, which depending on how you feel about burst step, either has its own unique defensive tool added, or is missing one entirely. I think that for the most part, these are great new additions to the game, though as a charge blade user, I personally feel that perfect guarding is a little bit overpowered, though I'm hardly complaining. And with that out of the way, I think now is as good a time as any to start talking about my issues with wilds. But before we get to my more serious concerns and complaints, I want to talk about some personal nitpicks and pet peeves of mine. Firstly,
why does the seikret have the same function as the palamute and the ability to do the same thing? Why does it feel worse, and why does it not give you a speed boost? And like, yeah, it's like a petty, like, why doesn't it make me go faster? But like, it's the simple concept of you already have the thing. This is clearly a copy paste of that thing in a sense. Why would you just, any step back seems like a reasonable thing to question. Like, why you already made this? Why would you take it away now? You know what I mean? Like,
and second, where the hell is my wire bug? Now hear me out. For those who didn't play Monster Hunter Rise, the wire bug was a new addition to the series that served several purposes and was the core of some excellent new mechanics. For starters, the wire bug was basically a point and shoot grappling hook that could pull you in any direction. But unlike a normal grappling hook, it didn't need to connect with anything to pull you in the desired direction, and you could do an extra jump after using it each time. Think of it like a more advanced on-demand wedge beetle. When combined with the ability to run up most walls and surfaces in the game, the wire bug made exploring the different biomes more engaging and exciting than ever. But we're not done yet. If you had an available wire bug charge and were sent flying by a monster, you could wire fall to instantly recover. And last but certainly not least, the wire bug charges also facilitated the use of every weapon's unique silkbind attacks. Each weapon had 3 silkbind moves, plus a 4th added with sunbreak, and you chose which 2 you wanted to equip. These ranged from things like counter peak performance, which gave my charge blade an invincible shield counter that fully charged my files on hit, to axe hopper, which used my axe like a giant insect glaive to pole vault my character into the air and bring the axe crashing down onto the monster's head. Every weapon got at least a couple of moves that were at least that cool, and combined with the wire bug movement, every weapon felt like it had so many more ways to engage a monster than before. By comparison in Wilds, we've been given a defensive tool and one new move in the form of the focus attack. Some weapons do have an additional feature attached to triggering the wound breaking animation from landing a focus attack on a wound, like how on my charge blade it activates a spinning axe mode from Rise, or how the insect blade gets all 3 extracts. But those feel like poor consolation prizes for losing access to so much movement and so many cool abilities. Now the most controversial aspect of the wire bug was that veterans argued it made the game easier, and it did. So I was hopeful that in lieu of having the wire bug, Wilds would at least be a return to a slightly more challenging Monster Hunter experience. Which brings me to my biggest issue with the game. As I was saying, this is not the first time that the latest Monster Hunter game has faced accusations of being too easy. However, it's important to note that Rise made the Monster Hunter formula easier by empowering the player with a variety of new tools. And of those tools, the only one that seemed particularly guilty of making the game easier was the wirefall. But it's worth bearing in mind that in Wilds, the Seikret's ability to pick you up out of a fall serves much of the same function in a less engaging way. Having said that, I hopped back into Rise just to refresh my memory for this video, and one thing was immediately obvious. In what must have been an effort to compensate for your ability to instantly recover with wirefall, nearly every attack from nearly every monster would launch me into the air. And it's this sort of compromise between the strength of the player's new tools and the strength of the monsters that Wilds is sorely missing. So let me explain. There are 2 mechanics primarily responsible for making Wilds too easy for its own good: Focus Mode and Wounds. Let's start with Focus Mode, which is probably my favorite new mechanic that Wilds introduces to the series. Focus Mode simply lets you aim your attacks, and in general, it makes combat feel much smoother. I genuinely love it, but it's admittedly a pretty big change for Monster Hunter. Traditionally, one of the challenges of Monster Hunter, that I wasn't really a fan of, was getting every attack in your combo, including and especially your biggest moves, to actually connect with the monster. This has all but been removed in Monster Hunter Wilds, and I do think that's for the better. I do really appreciate that my most powerful attack doesn't whiff because the monster stepped 2 feet to the left. But naturally, this means that unless you are already good enough to never whiff in previous Monster Hunter titles, not me, the vast majority of players are now doing far more damage far more consistently than ever before. But on its own, I don't think that'd be enough to trivialize the game. It's when paired with how wounds work that the problem arises. Now the way wounds work is that repeated attacks to the same part of the monster will create a wound. Not only do your attacks deal more damage when striking a wound, but you can also hit them with a focus attack, which will trigger a unique wound breaking attack. During this wound breaking animation, you're completely invincible, and on top of that, breaking a wound frequently staggers and or knocks down the monster. I'm sure you can see where I'm going with this. Between the substantial increase in most players' damage provided by focus mode and wound breaking attacks, the increased damage monsters are taking from having wounds, and how frequently breaking said wounds staggers and knocks them over, monsters in Wilds are taking more damage than ever before, faster than ever before, while spending more time locked in place than ever before. Obviously, this is a huge contributing factor to the game being so easy, but I don't think that's the problem all on its own. You see, we have been empowered to a similar and possibly greater degree than in Rise. The real problem is that the monsters have been given nothing to compensate. It feels as though we are fighting monsters of the same or even lower relative strength than ever before, while being more powerful than ever. And it's this huge power discrepancy which has siphoned nearly all of the challenge from the game at every level of play. But okay, so what? The game is too easy, what's wrong with that? Normally, this is the part of the video where I try to explain things in concise and simple terms, because I don't want to bore anyone. But screw that, it's my video, and frankly, I don't think people understand the following sentiment as well as they think they do or should. So here we go. I'm sure you've heard the phrase, a game made for everyone is a game made for no one. And if you haven't, then, I don't know, consider yourself informed. You're welcome. Obviously, the premise is quite simple. The more you try to cater to a wider group of people, the more you inevitably start to run up against homogenization. Or in other words, games start to feel too similar and familiar. Some common examples of homogenization you might recognize would be how for a while, modern AAA games all seem to have a Ubisoft-inspired open world. Or how Souls-likes and 2D Metroidvanias have taken over action games and the indie scene respectively. You get the idea. Now depending on who you ask, homogenization in those cases can be seen as either a good or a bad thing. But sometimes homogenization is just harmless. Think of the ability to sprint in games. These days, it's pretty damn weird to play any kind of first or third person action game or shooter that doesn't let you sprint in some form or another. And like most people, when I play a game without a sprint or with one that takes a less conventional form, it admittedly does feel pretty weird. That aside, I'm sure the kind of smart people that like watching my videos already recognize the negative side of homogenization. When something about a game can be identified as being directly responsible for increasing its popularity, there's a lot of incentive for developers of other games to borrow that, which is fine on its own. But the darker side of it is that there's even more incentive for publishers to encourage or demand that developers take a similar approach and make games more homogenized, even if it conflicts with their vision. The point is that while homogenization can make games more familiar in positive ways, it's often indicative of publisher interference and runs the risk of sanding away what makes games such special and unique experiences that stick with us. And in my not-so-humble opinion, the single worst way in which games have become more homogenized in recent years is in their approach to difficulty. Now before people start typing angry comments, I want to make something very clear. I do not take issue with this game or any game for that matter making an effort to ease in new or less skilled players. I don't think that making a game hard to learn is an interesting challenge or a meaningful way of increasing a game's difficulty. So when I say that Monster Hunter Wilds is too easy, I'm not talking about low rank or even the earlier parts of high rank. While both are definitely way easier than in previous titles, I think it's perfectly fine for the game to be an approachable and inviting experience all the way up through the end of the main quest chain as a means of teaching people how to play the game. I'm also not talking about quality of life or accessibility features, but since I just mentioned it, now's as good a time as any to take care of something real quick. Welcome to Bond's Ranting Corner, and today we're here to talk about how accessibility and approachability are not the same thing, and why it's downright offensive to suggest that games being made easier is in any way adjacent to accessibility. Accessibility is about making it possible for people with disabilities to engage and interact with video games in the same ways able-bodied people can. Disabled people are not asking for games to be easier. They're asking for a way to hit the dodge button without the use of their hands, or a way to see on-screen indicators for mechanics that rely on the ability to hear. I mean this with all my heart. If you think that games should be made easier to make them more accessible, you're either being an ableist piece of shit or you're confusing accessibility for approachability. Making games more accessible doesn't in any way overlap with making them easier and more homogenized, but making games more approachable does. Now back to my point about Monster Hunter Wilds being too easy. I am not a Monster Hunter veteran with hundreds or thousands of hours in this franchise. I played something like 30 to 50 hours of World a long time ago, and about 100 hours of Rise back when it first came out. I am not calling Wilds easy because I am some monster hunting god who is demanding a challenge worthy of my imaginary skills. My issue is that at the time of this recording, there is virtually no meaningful late game progression or any challenge that encourages engaging with the game more deeply. Anecdotally speaking, I've only had 2 really great and challenging fights in 120 hours, those being max strength gold crown versions of tempered arkveld and tempered gore magala, which I've now fought dozens of times and neither of which required a particularly strong build to clear the first time. If you're wondering why I'm saying the game has no endgame content with 120 hours played, it's because I wasn't lying when I said I still like the game. The problem is, I had burned through basically all of its actual content in like 50 hours, had multiple min-max builds completed soon after that, and I spent the last 60 plus hours looking for any excuse to keep going. Because the unfortunate reality is that the game hasn't at any point given me that reason. I've mostly been making up dumb challenges for myself and crafting things I'll never use just for the sake of it. In the game's current state, there isn't any reason to craft perfect artian weapons as there's no challenge that remotely demands a perfect build, but I keep doing it anyway. There's no reason to continue increasing hunter rank or gathering materials, but I keep doing it anyway. There's no fight to test myself against, no content that pushes myself or my friends to try particularly hard, and we do all hope that content is coming. But at least for me, there's no escaping the feeling that the only way for the game to deliver on the kind of challenge we all crave would be to increase the difficulty of future content so substantially that it would break the currently established curve, and you'd just make even more people angry. And even though these things do create a shared feeling of disappointment in a game we've all enjoyed, I mentioned at the start of this video that my real concern isn't that the game is so much easier, but rather the reason why it's so much easier. The lack of challenging content, the substantial focus on approachability, and the trimming away of so many features to make room for so few new ones are all symptoms of a more troubling trend. But unfortunately, you'll have to take what follows with a grain of salt, because to really know if my concerns are valid, I'd have to speak with the devs and get their honest feedback. The problem is that I can't ask the Monster Hunter devs if they made the game easier because they genuinely think that it should be easier. And I can't ask if they made that choice because they believe the game would be better for it, or if that was even their intention to begin with. And so I can only go off of what I know. In this industry, every game, no matter how successful it is, must be more successful than its predecessor or it's considered a failure. As I mentioned earlier, games have been growing more homogenized and not always for the worse. But making games easier is one of the most consistent and effective means of homogenization when it comes to bringing in more players. This means that for strictly business reasons, there is always an incentive to make games easier. Even though, as we've seen with titles from the likes of From Software and many others, including other Monster Hunter games, being a great game is infinitely more important to bringing in new fans than patronizing them with a lack of challenge ever could be. Games have the most potential to be their best when developers are allowed to both evolve and iterate on that which came before, and that doesn't have to make said games more challenging. Monster Hunter already does this and adds some nice features in every game that improve the quality of life for players and in small ways make the game easier. But this time around, it's hard to reconcile with what was taken away because it feels like a lot less has been added back. And what has been added is a lot more powerful despite being far simpler. Honestly, all that'd be fine if I believed the motivation for making it that way came from the devs and their desire to create a better game. But I have a hard time believing that when so many signs point towards a mandate to make it more popular at all costs. And that desire to be even more popular, to be for even more people despite the series already being a massive success, is far more indicative of shareholder greed than of the developer's own ambitions.
Capcom's a publicly owned company, which means it's fueled by investors, which means to them a line chart in red is way worse than Steam reviews in red. The Japanese fiscal year ends March 31st. Capcom's goal for 2024 was 165 billion yen, but in December it was revealed they only had 90 billion of that, which is why they launched with a barely acceptable PC port on February 28. It gives them a better chance to make ends meet in a month. And it paid off. Monster Hunter Wilds made $500,000 in USD in just the first 4 days, which actually translates to roughly 75 billion yen. Add that 75 billion to their already established 90 billion, that is exactly their forecasted number for the year. Now, if they missed that figure, what do you think would have happened? They become underfunded and the first people they drop are developers, which would be bad for everybody because this game thrives on post-launch support.
I'm not trying to say that the game should be harder because I like hard games and they all should cater to me. I'm saying that the game is objectively easier, and I'm concerned that the reason for this isn't because the developers believe that's what will make it a better Monster Hunter, but rather because that's what their publisher believes will make a more profitable one. And that would be the real disappointment. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ding the little bell to be notified when my next one goes live. That's all for now, folks. See you next time.